In the burning heart of the 12th century, when the world seemed carved by sword and scripture, one name would rise from the sands, not as conqueror nor saint, but as a paradox: Saladin. To the Crusaders, he was the enemy of Christ. To his own people, a defender of faith. Yet, across centuries, even his foes would whisper his name with reverence, a rare title earned not by blood, but by honour. The desert remembers him. The wind that sweeps across the plains of Syria still whispers of the man who stood between empires, a warrior who fought the West, yet embodied its highest ideals. He was the enemy who became a legend, the conqueror who conquered his own pride. Our story begins not in triumph, but in a world bleeding under the weight of holy war. The year is 1137, and the Crusader states stand like thorns in the flesh of the Islamic world. Jerusalem, the sacred heart of three faiths, lies under Christian control. Kingdoms and sultanates rise and fall with dizzying speed, each claiming divine purpose, each shadowed by betrayal. Amid this fractured landscape, a boy named Yusuf ibn Ayyub is born in the city of Tikrit on the banks of the Tigris. He is not destined for glory, not yet. His father is a Kurdish officer serving the Seljuk Turks. His family modest, honourable, bound by duty. When Yusuf is born, his family is exiled from Tikrit the very night of his birth. Some said it was an omen that the child who entered the world as his family fled into darkness would one day redeem it through mercy. Years pass. The boy grows among soldiers and scholars, in a world where faith and steel shape destiny. He learns that true power is not in the sword, but in restraint. That victory without justice is another form of defeat. These lessons, absorbed in silence, will later define him more than any battle. By the time he reaches manhood, the Muslim world is fractured, divided between Sunni and Shia, between Damascus and Cairo, between ambition and faith. The Crusaders watch from their stone castles, content to rule a land too weary to resist. But in Damascus, under the guidance of Nur ad-Din Zangi, a flame begins to stir, a dream of unity, of moral renewal, of driving out the invaders not just with armies, but with purpose. And in that court, young Yusuf begins his quiet ascent, a soldier who prays before he fights, a leader who listens before he commands. He does not seek fame, yet destiny circles him like a hawk. The desert has always been a mirror of the soul, vast, unforgiving, and honest. It shapes men by what it withholds. And in that endless horizon, Yusuf ibn Ayyub will learn that sometimes to serve God is to serve mercy itself. He will become known by another name, Salah ad-Din, the righteousness of the faith. But before the world would call him a legend, he would have to become its enemy first. When Yusuf ibn Ayyub first rode beneath the walls of Damascus, he was not yet the man history would remember. He was quiet, almost too quiet for a soldier, a man who observed more than he spoke, who listened when others shouted. The city itself was a living contradiction, ancient and sacred, yet torn by ambition. Damascus was the heart of the Islamic world's dream and its failure, a place where scholars recited verses of mercy while emirs plotted wars in marble halls. It was here that Yusuf came under the guidance of Nur ad-Din Zangi, the ruler of Syria, a man fierce in faith and fierce in justice. Nur ad-Din was not like other kings. He believed that victory came not from strength of arms, but from the purity of intention. "If we are divided," he once said, The cross will reign over the crescent. His vision was to unite the Muslim world, not just in war, but in righteousness. In Nur ad-Din's court, Yusuf learned what no sword could teach, that faith, when corrupted by pride, destroys the very thing it claims to defend. He studied theology, listened to jurists and imams, and read the Quran with the patience of a scholar, not the arrogance of a prince. When he spoke of God, he spoke not as a zealot, but as a man searching for balance, a man who feared injustice more than defeat. Still, destiny would not let him remain a student for long. The call to arms came from Egypt, where the Fatimid Caliphate, weakened and decaying, teetered between collapse and conquest. Nur ad-Din sent an expedition to restore order, and Yusuf, though reluctant, was chosen to accompany his uncle Shirkuh, a general of iron discipline and boundless ambition. The campaign to Egypt would change everything. It was a world unlike Syria, lush, ancient, heavy with the weight of pharaohs and prophets. Cairo shimmered beneath the Nile's light, but its heart was poisoned by intrigue. The Fatimid rulers were Shia, Nur ad-Din's forces were Sunni. Beneath every alliance hid a betrayal, beneath every treaty a blade. Yusuf entered this theatre not as a conqueror, but as a witness to the madness of power. He saw men who claimed to fight for God, but died for gold. He watched armies march beneath banners of faith, while merchants traded the outcome of battles before they were fought. And in this chaos, Yusuf found a strange clarity. Perhaps true victory was not to conquer others, but to master oneself. When his uncle Shirkuh died suddenly, the fate of Egypt hung in balance. Nur ad-Din's commanders debated, schemed, accused, yet all eyes turned to Yusuf. The young Kurd, quiet and restrained, was appointed vizier of Egypt, a position of immense power over a divided and suspicious nation. Few realized that day what they had set in motion. The man they called Salah ad-Din would soon unite not just Egypt and Syria, but an entire people under one vision, a vision not of revenge, but of justice sanctified by mercy. He would rebuild the idea that had nearly vanished, that righteousness could still exist in the age of war. But before that light would rise, it would have to pass through shadow. Power reveals a man faster than war. When Yusuf ibn Ayyub, now Salah ad-Din, became vizier of Egypt, the crown he wore was made not of gold but of fire. The Fatimid Caliphate was dying, and with its last breaths came suspicion, rebellion, and whispers in every corner of Cairo. He ruled in the name of Nur ad-Din, yet stood alone in a court where every ally could become an assassin before dawn. He was barely 30, the weight of centuries sat on his shoulders. Saladin had no love for politics, yet politics had claimed him. He rebuilt the crumbling army, reformed taxation, and restored the mosques to the Sunni call to prayer acts that won him enemies as quickly as respect. Every choice was a knife's edge. If he ruled with weakness, Egypt would fall. If he ruled with tyranny, his soul would. One night, as the city slept beneath the Nile's moonlight, flames erupted in the southern quarter, an uprising led by those loyal to the old Fatimid Caliph. Saladin's guards rushed to defend the palace. The vizier himself rode into the chaos, sword unsheathed but eyes calm. When the rebels were cornered, his captains demanded execution. Instead, he ordered them to be fed, tended, and spared. "Why show mercy to men who would kill you?" his aide asked. Saladin replied softly, "Because I do not serve vengeance. I serve God, and he has no need of my cruelty." That night became legend. Even those who plotted against him could not deny his justice. Slowly, the fires of rebellion dimmed, not from fear, but from the disarming power of mercy. It was not the kind of victory the world admired, yet it was the kind that made the world remember. Then came the turning of fate. Nur ad-Din, the master he revered, died suddenly in 1174. His death left the Muslim world leaderless once again, and chaos rushed to fill the void. Saladin stood at a crossroads. Remain loyal to the memory of his teacher, or take the mantle himself and risk being branded a usurper. He chose the harder path. Marching north from Cairo, he entered Damascus, the very heart of Nur ad-Din's legacy. But Damascus did not open its gates easily. To many, he was still an outsider, a Kurdish soldier who had risen too far. They accused him of ambition, of hypocrisy, of lust for power. Yet when the city finally surrendered, Saladin entered not as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim. He rode no white steed, carried no banners, and ordered his men to shed no blood. He prayed at the Umayyad Mosque, tears falling silently as the call to prayer echoed through the streets he once walked as a humble student. That day, Damascus witnessed something rarer than triumph restraint. And yet, as unity began to form under his rule, Saladin knew what lay ahead. Across the sea, in the strongholds of Acre and Jerusalem, the Crusader kings sharpened their swords once more. War was coming, not for conquest, but for the soul of the Holy Land. The fire he had extinguished in Damascus would soon return this time, to consume the world. By the time Saladin returned to Damascus as Sultan of both Egypt and Syria, the world had begun to whisper his name. Yet the title he carried weighed heavier than the sword he bore. To rule was one thing, to unite was another. The Muslim world, fractured by centuries of mistrust, would not be bound by decree alone. He rode through the lands of Aleppo and Mosul, not to conquer, but to persuade. Some rulers yielded to his vision of unity, others saw in him a threat greater than the Crusaders themselves. Each victory demanded not only battle, but restraint. Each surrender required mercy, sharper than any blade. But in the distance, the shadow of Jerusalem loomed a reminder of all that was lost. The Holy City had been under Christian rule since the First Crusade. Pilgrims still prayed at its walls, but for Saladin, it was not merely a city, it was the symbol of faith betrayed, of a land divided by arrogance and greed. He would not storm it in rage, he would reclaim it through destiny. Yet destiny demanded blood. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, weakened by internal strife, was ruled by King Guy de Lusignan, a man more bound to pride than wisdom. His rival, Reynald of Chatillon, was worse, a warlord whose cruelty knew no faith. Reynald broke truces, raided pilgrim caravans, and even threatened Mecca itself. To Saladin, this was not just provocation, it was sacrilege. When word reached him that Reynald had attacked a peaceful caravan under his protection, killing merchants and mocking the Prophet, something ancient stirred in him. For years, Saladin had held his sword in patience now. He unsheathed it for justice. He gathered his emirs beneath the banners of the Crescent and declared, "No faith can survive without honour. No peace can stand upon insult. God has called us to unity, and the test of that unity is near." The drums of jihad thundered across the plains. From Egypt to Syria, men came not for plunder, but for purpose. Scholars blessed their march, poets sang of divine justice. For the first time in generations, the Muslim world moved as one body, one voice, one heart. As his army marched north, Saladin rode at its head, calm, resolute, praying under the open sky. He was no longer the cautious vizier of Cairo or the quiet student of Damascus. He was now the embodiment of a dream older than himself, the restoration of faith through righteousness. In letters sent to kings and priests alike, he wrote not of hate, but of inevitability. Jerusalem does not belong to one people, but to all who worship the one God. Yet those who defile it with cruelty shall lose it. Across the sea, the Latin kingdoms trembled. The Templars prepared their fortresses, and the Pope in Rome called for vigilance. The sands of the Holy Land grew restless, knowing the storm was near. And in the twilight before battle, Saladin stood upon a hill overlooking the plains of Hattin, a place whose name few yet knew. The wind whispered through his cloak as the sun sank into the horizon, turning the world gold and crimson. He looked toward the west, toward Jerusalem's distant glow, and murmured a prayer that only the desert heard. The hour had come. The crescent would rise again, not to destroy the cross, but to remind the world what faith had forgotten. The summer of 1187 was merciless. The winds off the desert burned like breath from a furnace, and the Crusader banners, once symbols of holy might, drooped lifeless under a sun that seemed to judge all men equally. Saladin had waited years for this. The moment had not come through rage or accident, but through patience. Every siege, every alliance, every prayer had led to this ridge of scorched earth near the village of Hattin, west of the Sea of Galilee. There, the fate of Jerusalem itself would be decided. Across the plain, the Crusader army gleamed Guy de Lusignan, Reynald of Châtillon, the Templars, the Hospitallers' men forged in zeal and pride. They had marched to save Jerusalem, but they had done so blinded by arrogance. Saladin had cut off their wells, surrounded them, and waited as thirst became his greatest ally. At dawn, he stood upon a low hill, his standard, the green banner of the prophet, fluttering beside him. His men prayed in unison, thousands bowing as one wave of faith under the blazing sky. Then he gave the order. The drums thundered, arrows darkened the sun. The Crusaders, parched and desperate, tried to charge uphill, their armour glinting like molten mirrors. But every advance met a storm of arrows. Every retreat found fire waiting. Saladin's troops had set the dry grass alight, and now the battlefield itself became a weapon. Smoke, heat, and dust turned day into nightmare. The horns of the Templars blared, but their ranks broke. Their water wagons were overturned. The true terror of the day was not Saladin's sword, but the relentless patience of his strategy. By midday, the Crusaders were encircled. The relic of the true cross, carried into battle as divine protection, was seized by Saladin's soldiers, a symbol of centuries of crusading pride brought low in a single heartbeat. When the fighting ceased, the plain was silent, except for the sound of banners falling. In the centre, King Guy and Reynald were captured and brought before Saladin. The Sultan rose from his tent, his face serene, not triumphant, but grave. He offered the king a cup of water, a gesture of respect. But when Reynald reached to drink, Saladin stopped him. "You have broken every oath," he said quietly. "You slew the pilgrims of God, mocked his prophet, and defiled every promise of peace. There will be no mercy for a man without honour." And with a single stroke, he ended Reynald's life not in rage, but in cold justice. King Guy trembled, certain he would share the same fate. Instead, Saladin turned to him and said, "A king does not kill another king. Go, and remember how easily pride burns." That day, the Crusader kingdom was broken. The survivors fled toward the coast, leaving Jerusalem naked before Saladin's mercy. Word of Hattin spread like divine thunder across the world, to Rome, to Paris, to London. The Christian world called it catastrophe. The Muslim world called it vindication. But to Saladin, it was neither. It was only necessary. He prayed not in triumph, but in humility, whispering, "All power belongs to God alone." He knew the hardest part had yet to come. For it is one thing to win a war, another to win the peace that follows. Ahead lay Jerusalem, the city that had broken empires, faiths, and men. And soon it would test his mercy as deeply as Hattin had tested his strength. The victory at Hattin shook the world, but it also awakened the lion across the sea. In the courts of Europe, preachers thundered from pulpits that Jerusalem, the holiest city, had fallen to the infidel. Kings tore their garments, popes called for vengeance, and knights once content with comfort now felt the pull of destiny. Among them was a king whose name would burn through legend, Richard of England, called the Lionheart. Brave, brilliant, and unyielding, Richard was the mirror image of Saladin, born of privilege, tempered by war, and haunted by faith. They would never meet face to face, yet they would come to understand each other more deeply than most men know their friends. By 1189, the Third Crusade began. Armies from England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire crossed oceans to reclaim Jerusalem. Saladin, who had spent his life uniting his people, now faced the united fury of the West, but he did not waver. "They come for God," he said, "and so do we. Let us see which of us remembers him more." The Crusaders landed on the coast of Palestine and besieged Acre, a key fortress by the sea. For 2 long years, the city became a graveyard of faith. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion devoured both sides. Yet, amid the suffering, stories spread of Saladin's strange compassion. How he sent his personal physician to tend to Richard when the English king fell ill. How he returned a stolen horse to his rival. How he released captives who could not pay ransom, simply saying, "No man should profit from the misery of another." The Christian chroniclers themselves recorded it with awe. To them, Saladin was no longer merely the Sultan of the Saracens. He was a knight of honour, the kind their own poets dreamed of but rarely met. Richard, too, came to admire the man he fought. "He is the noblest enemy I have ever known," he said, "and I would rather lose Jerusalem to him than win it through treachery." For months their forces clashed at Arsuf, at Jaffa, each battle a storm of courage and exhaustion. Richard's brilliance in command met Saladin's discipline and strategy, like 2 blades striking sparks in the night. Neither could destroy the other. Both seemed protected by something greater than steel. When Richard proposed a peace, one that would allow Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem unarmed, Saladin agreed without hesitation. "The earth belongs to God," he said. "Let those who seek him walk upon it in peace." They sealed their truce not with signatures, but with respect. And when Richard prepared to depart, he sent word to Saladin, "If I must lose Jerusalem, I am glad it is to such a man." Saladin smiled when he heard the words, not from pride, but from understanding. "We are 2 men who have dreamed of the same truth," he said softly. "That honour is greater than victory." The lion and the crescent had met not to destroy, but to reveal the rarest truth of war, that even among enemies there can be dignity. When the Crusaders sailed away, the Holy Land exhaled a long breath. The swords were sheathed, but the memory endured of 2 men divided by faith, yet united by principle. And as the tides withdrew from Acre's blood-soaked shore, Saladin turned his face toward Jerusalem once more, knowing peace, like war, demands a price only the righteous can pay. The walls of Jerusalem stood silent under the burning light of October, 1187. 50 years had passed since the Crusaders first tore through its gates, painting its stones red with blood. Now the city waited trembling for the army of Salah ad-Din. He had come not as a destroyer, but as a man haunted by memory. Before him lay the city that had divided the world, the city for which empires had sinned in the name of heaven. Saladin dismounted his horse and approached its walls on foot. He did not raise his sword. He raised his gaze to the dome of the rock, to the crosses and towers that pierced the sky. To him, this was not conquest. It was return. Inside, the Christian defenders knew the end had come. After Hattin, their armies were broken. Their king was captive. The holy city was surrounded. The commander, Balian of Ibelin, requested an audience. Saladin received him not in armor, but in white robes, his face calm as still water. Balian pleaded for mercy for the people, for the children, for the pilgrims who had nowhere left to flee. Saladin listened. Then he said, "When your forefathers took this city, they slaughtered every soul within it. But I am not them. I am Salah ad-Din." And with those words, the gates opened. No massacre followed, no vengeance, no burning of churches or temples. The conqueror, who could have washed the city in blood, instead bathed it in mercy. He allowed the Christians to leave safely, to ransom their families, to carry their crosses and relics without fear. The Patriarch of Jerusalem himself marched out with his people, and Saladin ordered his guards to protect them. Even the poorest who could not afford ransom were spared. When his treasury emptied, Saladin paid their debts himself. His captains protested. He silenced them with a single sentence: "Jerusalem is not a prize. It is a trust before God." When the call to prayer first rose from Al-Aqsa Mosque after half a century, many wept not for triumph, but for the return of balance. For the first time, the city's three faiths breathed under one sky without slaughter. In Europe, the news caused disbelief. The Pope declared days of mourning. Knights and priests demanded revenge. Yet even among the Crusaders, tales spread of Saladin's mercy of the conqueror who refused to hate. Chroniclers who had once cursed his name now called him the most virtuous of Saracens. That day, the image of the savage East dissolved in the light of a single man's compassion, and Saladin, standing before the golden dome, felt no joy, only the weight of the promise he had made to God, to fight for righteousness, not revenge. At sunset, he walked barefoot through the city he had reclaimed, his sword sheathed. Children followed him in silence. Pilgrims knelt where he passed. A priest, watching from afar, whispered to a scribe, "We came to find Christ among our own, but perhaps he walks today with the Sultan." Jerusalem had been taken, but not by force. It had been redeemed by mercy. And in that moment, the world glimpsed what power could look like when touched by faith, not fury. Greatness, once won, rarely lets a man rest. In the years after Jerusalem's return, Saladin's name became a prayer upon lips from Cairo to Damascus. Poets called him the Sword of God. Rulers who once defied him now sought his blessing. Yet behind the glory, the man himself grew weary. Peace, he learned, was far heavier than war. His empire stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates, vast, complex, fragile. Every governor demanded reward, every ally expected tribute. While his people praised his justice, his coffers emptied. He had given away much of his fortune to ransom captives, feed the poor, rebuild mosques, and heal what war had broken. His treasurers begged restraint. Saladin smiled and said, "What wealth has meaning if men go hungry?" But there were shadows even his light could not reach. The Crusaders still held strongholds along the coast, Tyre, Tripoli, Acre, and across the sea. Europe's kings prepared yet another crusade. word came that Richard the Lionheart himself had landed again. Old soldiers rallied to him. His brothers in arms urged another campaign. Yet something in Saladin had changed. The man who once rode at the front of every charge now lingered behind, watching the horizon more than the enemy. He saw his sons quarrel over inheritance. He saw governors grow greedy and scholars grow silent. The unity he had built through faith began to fracture under ambition. He had conquered the holy city, but the world and the human heart refused to stay conquered. At night, he prayed longer than ever before. His attendants sometimes found him kneeling long after dawn, whispering verses through tears. "I have seen what kings become," he said once. "If I forget justice for a single hour, may God strip this crown from me." He met Richard again not in battle, but in negotiation. Both men, exhausted by years of war, sought something nobler than victory. When peace was finally signed, Richard kissed the cross, Saladin bowed toward Mecca. Between them stretched no hatred, only the silent understanding that both had given everything to something greater than themselves. When Richard departed the Holy Land, Saladin stood watching from the walls of Jerusalem. "There goes a man I could have called friend," he said quietly. He turned back to his palace, where the candles burned low. His health began to fade soon after the cost of years spent in armor, fasting, sleeplessness, and grief. Yet he refused luxury. He gave away what little remained of his wealth to the poor. When his physicians warned him to rest, he answered, "Rest is not for those who must answer before God." The empire still adored him, but few understood the loneliness of the throne. Every decision carved another scar into his heart. He had built a world from chaos, yet knew how easily it could crumble again. And so the Sultan of Mercy, who had once bent kings to his will, began to fade like a star at dawn, his light no less real, but gentler now, more human. The desert winds that had carried his banners now carried only prayers. He had given the world unity and found, in return, solitude. The great Sultan who had commanded armies and humbled kings now lay upon a simple straw mattress in Damascus. The room was bare. No banners hung on its walls. No gold shimmered under the lamplight. Around him, the few servants who remained whispered prayers, their voices trembling with grief. It was March 1193. Outside, spring winds carried the scent of orange blossoms through the streets of Damascus. Inside, Salah ad-Din, the conqueror of Jerusalem, the Lion of Islam, fought a quieter battle to meet death with peace. For months, his body had weakened, his spirit burning brighter even as the flesh failed. His physicians urged comfort. He refused. His sons offered riches. He gave them away. One by one, he ordered that his treasures be distributed to the poor, his clothes, his horses, even the coins in his belt. "A man," he whispered, "should meet God free of all that binds him." The court scribes came to record his will, expecting the usual wealth of a monarch. Instead, they found almost nothing. "We have found no gold, my lord," they said. Saladin smiled faintly. "Then write this," he told them. "Write that Salah ad-Din, who once ruled Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia, leaves behind not enough to pay for his own burial." When he could no longer stand, he asked to be lifted toward the window. He wanted to see the city one last time, the same Damascus where he had once walked as a young student under Nur ad-Din. Its domes gleamed in the morning light. Children laughed in the streets. The call to prayer echoed softly through the air. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Praise be to God, who allowed me to restore what was lost and forgive what I could not mend." Those present wept, but he raised his hand gently, asking silence. "Do not mourn me," he said. "The world is a shadow that passes. Only the truth we live for remains." A silence fell over the room. His lips moved again, barely audible. It was the same prayer he had recited before every battle. There is no power and no strength except through God, the Most High, the Most Great. And then, as the dawn light touched his face, the man who had conquered Jerusalem exhaled his last breath, not as a sultan, not as a warrior, but as a servant of mercy. The news spread across continents. In Cairo, men wept in the streets. In Mosul, the muezzins recited his name between verses of the Quran. In the Crusader states, even his enemies lowered their banners in mourning. Chroniclers from Europe wrote of his passing with reverence. One monk in England penned, "If virtue could be found in the East, it lived in Saladin." He was buried in a modest tomb beside the Umayyad Mosque. No marble, no gilded dome, only a stone inscribed with his name and a verse from the Quran. Centuries later, when conquerors and empires had turned to dust, pilgrims still came to stand before it, not to pray for him, but to remember what a man could be when guided by conscience rather than conquest. The winds that once carried the scent of war now carried peace over Damascus. And in that quiet air, the name Salah ad-Din ceased to be a title. It became a reminder that the greatest victories are won not on battlefields, but in the soul. Centuries have passed since the dust of Saladin's sandals last touched the earth. Empires have risen and vanished. The banners of both cross and crescent have faded under the same sun. Yet his name, Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, still moves across history like a breath that refuses to die. He was born in exile, crowned in unity, and buried in humility. He conquered kingdoms, yet possessed nothing when he died. He faced enemies who feared him and left them with admiration instead. In an age when faith was used as a sword, Saladin made it a bridge. He proved that righteousness was not confined to creed or culture, that mercy could stand taller than any fortress. While kings fought for power, he fought for principle. While others sought to be remembered, he sought to be right before God. Even those who fought against him could not escape his light. The chronicler Imad ad-Din al-Isfahani, who served at his side, wrote, "His justice flowed over friend and foe alike." And in Europe, Baha ad-Din recorded with awe how the very knights who once swore to destroy him spoke his name with reverence. Richard the Lionheart called him the greatest and most gracious prince in the world. In that single sentence lies the miracle of Saladin's legacy, that a man could fight a holy war without ever losing his humanity. He stood in a time when cruelty was celebrated, when victory was measured by corpses, and yet he chose compassion over revenge. When Jerusalem fell, he shed no blood. When power was his, he took no wealth. When enemies mocked his faith, he answered with dignity. That is why his story endures, because it is not about conquest, but about conscience. In the modern world, where empires wear new names and nations still draw lines with hatred, Saladin's example speaks louder than ever. He reminds us that greatness is not measured by how many we defeat, but by how many we uplift. That faith, stripped of mercy, becomes tyranny. That justice without humility becomes another form of pride. His life asks us the question that every age must answer anew. What does it mean to be righteous in a world that rewards cruelty? Saladin answered not with words, but with deeds. He showed that power can serve peace, that belief can coexist with respect, and that even an enemy can be a man of God. When his tomb in Damascus was opened centuries later, visitors found two coffins, one of stone, one of wood. On the stone lay a single inscription, simple, unadorned. Here lies Salah ad-Din, who liberated Jerusalem. But his truest epitaph is written in memory, not marble. It lives wherever compassion defies hatred, wherever honor stands against corruption, wherever those who hold power remember to bow before something greater than themselves. He was the enemy who became a legend not because he won, but because he forgave. And as long as the world still dreams of justice tempered by mercy, the wind will whisper his name through the ruins and the sands, reminding kings and commoners alike that the greatest victory is to conquer the self. In every age, the world breeds warriors, but only a few become healers of the very wounds they inflict. Remember Saladin. Remember that the true mark of greatness is not how fiercely we fight, but how deeply we love what is right.